All right, 3, 2, 1, and we're live here with Dr. Matthew Minard. First time on the podcast, but I've read your stuff. I've heard you before, and it's always good stuff. And I just want to thank you, Matthew, for taking the time to be here with me. Welcome to the show.
It's a great pleasure, Pat. I float around digitally online, so people can see me there or see me in print, I guess. But thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, since it's your first time on the show, and I think we're going to start off by talking about the philosophy of Jacques Maritain. He was deeply influential, still is, for my own development of thought. And I know that you have been known, at least in your past life, as the Maritain guy. So I'm sure you have some interesting things to say about him. But tell us about who you are and what you do and how you got to be into all this philosophy business.
Yeah. So I have my tagline for the books, right? I'm a Ruthenian Catholic, which means that I'm a member of the Sui Juris, the independent church within the Catholic Communion of Transcarpathians that go back basically about the time of St. Cyril and Methodius, the patrons to the Slavs, the apostles to the Slavs. I was raised a Roman Catholic, spent a little bit of time in the world of the traditional Latin Mass, but never quite felt at home, and then just felt right at home in the Ruthenian Church. So that's where I've been, and luckily I live in Western Pennsylvania, which is coal country. So we still have the leftover remnants of all the Slavic churches, although they keep getting smaller and smaller. Yeah. But then husband and father, and then I serve as as a professor of philosophy and actually moral theology at the Byzantine Catholic Seminary in Pittsburgh. So that's the primary I'm core faculty. We don't do tenure track stuff there, but I'm in the core faculty there. And then I do a little bit of teaching also for Holy Apostles. I started doing that this semester. A friend tossed a course my direction to teach a bit of Thomism, which I don't do right at a Greek seminary. So maybe a teeny bit here and there. But so anyway, yes, that's sort of my professional gig that way. And then I do a good bit of translating work as well. I mean, I don't know actually if you'll keep a video record, but I have a whole wall of my very Western translation texts, a lot of Garrigou Lagrange, Bobby Nicolas, Ambrose Gardet, and others that I've done translations of. The quite literally most recent one is a set of translations on conscience that Clooney Press is doing. They just posted it on Amazon. So
very cool. Very cool. Well, we'll have to bring you back on. I was just going to say we'll have to bring you back on to talk about Garrigou at some point, because he's obviously got a relationship with Maritain in different and important ways. So that would be good. All right, so let's dive in, because recently you had a conversation with Michael Lofton. You're featured on his channel a lot. Always good stuff. And it was about Maritain, and you guys kind of talked a bit about his political side and his political philosophy. I want to bracket that for this conversation, because
that's good.
Yeah.
Talk about this beforehand, listeners. So that makes me happy, because people get bogged down in the political stuff.
And honestly, that aspect of Maritain was not what I always found the most interesting. Anyways, whatever else you want to say about it. Where Maritain struck me as particularly interesting and worth reading was really on the problem of evil and predestination. And one of the first books I read from Maritain was a really hard one to get. It's called God and the Permission of Evil, and you cannot find this book anywhere. And when and this was obviously, and anybody who thinks about any significant theological issues is going to come up against the question of predestination eventually, right? And human freedom and eternity and all this and that. And I just remember when I first read that book, I just thought, he's really onto something. Right? I don't think he's got it all worked out just yet. And he seems to even admit where he's kind of struggling. And this is perennially a thorny issue of is God determined by creaturely free action and stuff like that. But he kind of gestures in the way of where he thinks his solution will be. And I just was always really attracted to the way that Maritain thought about predestination, the problem of evil, human freedom, the principle of sufficient reason. All of his metaphysical stuff to me was just really cool. So let's open it up there. What do you have to offer us? And we'll chase whatever thoughts you think are worth chasing here.
Yeah, that's interesting. So we're just jumping right in. It's for those who don't know who Jacques Maritain is, born in 1888, converts from a generally secular background in the turn of the 20th century, pretty soon thereafter becomes a Thomist. He dies as a little brother of Jesus, having been a Josephitely married man, though, for most of his life. But he dies in 73. Okay, well, come back, go watch what I said on Michael Lofton to fill in those things from Reason and Theology. That's funny that you bring that up, and now I'm having these memories of like our early kind of musings about what to talk about maybe with Maritain. His works on the problem of evil, he actually said, pardon me, were what he thought was the most important thing he wrote about.
I agree with. I think it was.
He says it. He says it explicitly, and I mean, it's like you think about all the other things that he did. It's like it's amazing that it's like that one little issue. You know, I mean, although it pops up in some other places, philosophy of history. Trying to think of like where outside of existence and the existent. That's kind of the first place you get a big half of a book that's dedicated to it. He then takes it up kind of again in that God and the Permission of Evil book that is I think actually, I think it might even come from that period where he's, after his wife died, that he's starting to give conferences, pretty high level conferences, let's be honest, to the Little Brothers of Jesus. And he's kind of giving philosophical talks, and then they become published in the Revue Thomiste, and then it got gathered into that volume. Very powerful little book that I think actually gets to the nub of one of the issues here is the Marquette lecture on God and the Permission of Evil.
Yeah, tremendous little volume. If people don't have it, you have to get at least that one.
Yeah, it's like it's clear. It's probably the one it's like the most exegetical. So Thomists have a kind of like bent to want to always just like exegete Thomas. I mean, this is one of these things I occasionally start thumping my hand about because I think it's a little bit too backwards looking, right? In the end, it's not about the texts. It's not about the words. It's about the truth, but we need to see the truth through the words. And I think that is a nice balance between reading the exact text of Aquinas on evil and then dealing with the problem itself. So it's really kind of cuts that balance. I think that matches kind of the bent of kind of two different kinds of Thomism, one that's more concerned just with the speculative problems and one that's more kind of historical and exegetical. Right. But so there is like one of the issues of evil, right? It's the causality problem. There's other stuff. Predestination is going to come in here because we have to deal with then the question of what is the nature of God's foresight? How does this play into the overall plan of things? There's in the background, although it just echoes up for him on occasion, the theological problem of how does this tie into the ultimate reason for creation? You know, the whole problem of how does the incarnation fit into the decrees of God? Like all of that's in the background. But one of the first things that's like really important to figure out is when you talk about the creaturely causality in the line of evil, how do you deal with that without putting blood on God's hands?
Yes.
Maybe if we put it in a simple syllogistic form, even though if we're going to make it like kind of too, it's like we're simplifying it too much. But if God's the creator of all things and all of their deeds, and some of the deeds of creatures are you know, fallible deeds that are they're imputable of evil, or evil is imputable of them, I should say. Well, then how is God not guilty of the causality of that evil? And so, you know, he, in that little text, he exegetes Thomas's very clear position. I mean, it's in I think it's in the Summa Theologiae, and it's in the De Malo questions, the disputed questions on evil. And it pops up elsewhere, a couple places, blindingly clear that what the creature actually does in failing is, in a sense, not observing the rule.
That's right. There's the negation, then the privation, and separating those out is such a brilliant insight, right?
Yeah, and so it's that negation of not considering the rule of reason. Okay, so let's consider that, because that's one thing where the text, I think, you need to develop it a tiny bit, in the sense that it's not just merely that the creature sort of has kind of platonically has concepts of, or Socratically, concepts of what would be the virtues, and then you don't pay attention to them. I mean, it is that, but it's more like the creature does not consider whatever the moral insight of what the scholastics would call synderisis is, or in the case of the supernatural order, which you got to be really careful with here, what the infused moral virtues or the theological virtues demand of me right here and now. Yes. There's something about my will that turns my attention away from what is asked of me in my concrete circumstances here. I can fail by intention, or I can even fail by choice as I'm exercising prudence. But all throughout there, I turn my gaze, it's all metaphor here, right? But I turn my intellectual or my spiritual gaze away. I slacken from the attention I should be giving to, you know, the calling that I have right now, and that not considering of my place right now in providence, not thinking through God's divine reasons, but like just considering providence playing out by way of moral reasoning right now, and the non-consideration of that is the negation, a kind of non-being. He uses sort of a neologism of annihilation.
Yep.
The non-being that I all of a sudden have woven into the divine causality.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And what's really mysterious here, and you got to be careful, and this is, I think you're going to agree with me, is just so brilliant, right? In the line of evil, that's where man is the cause, because it's non-being.
Yeah.
It's like a flip side of the Johannine words. He uses this in one of the books, right?
Without me, you can do nothing. He's like, literally.
That's what you did. You did not pay heed to what you were morally to do here now. And then it unfolds from there, right? That part of creaturely causality, which is in scholastic terminology, a kind of deficient causality. It's a causality that can fail. Mm-hmm. It can fall down. It then exercises itself, right? It's part of what is kind of just built into what it is to be a finite creature. Yes. I am not the rule of my action. Yep. Only God is, right? Mm-hmm. God cannot fail because he at once is his love, his rectitude of will, and everything else. But
he is his own rule, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, may I make another aside, because we kind of got this together on a quick schedule, so all my manicness is coming out. Another brilliant text that's related to this is the angel text.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
The sin of the angel text is also kind of in this line. I think, to be honest, that the sin of the angel text is the best Thomist approach to that. I think very highly of Father Jean-Hervé Nicolas, for example. In many ways, he's my theological master just as much as Garrigou, I start to realize. But they differed, Maritain and Father Nicolas. He was younger at the time. Nicolas lived till the 80s or till the 90s, I think.
Yeah, and he did later make a significant concession to Maritain without ever seeming to come fully in line with Maritain.
Exactly, yeah. By the time of the second volume of Synthèse Dogmatique, he kind of like throws his hands up in the air about the whole issue of what the scholastics refer to as the antecedent permissive decrees.
That's right, yeah. Mm-hmm.
God's determination to allow us to fail. And then, right, there's nothing after the failure. There's nothing injustice that God then owes to the creature. It's only by his beneficence that he would then extend more grace to lift the creature up. Right. And truth be told, I think that I've always understood whatever is left of antecedent permissive decrees precisely along the lines of Maritain. Which he's actually developing Garrigou a little bit. Garrigou does make this one point at one place in like the sense of mystery that not extending something is not the same as positively damning or positive, right? It's not a positive damnation.
That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right. So we just jumped into the deep end real quick with some of this stuff. So let me just share a few things that I think Maritain does a really great job of highlighting when it comes to like principles of how to think through the problem of evil. One is like, divine universal causality for sure. God causes the act of sin, but he doesn't cause the defect in virtue of which it is a sin, right? And he has this awesome metaphysical analysis to show how that's the case. First with the negation and before the privation where the act of judgment comes in.
For that, the Permission of Evil book has like kind of the nice little diagrams and all that.
Yeah, so that is one thing where you have to read Maritain on that. Another thing is you talked about God as his sort of own moral rule. And this was really, I think this helps to give, I'll be curious your thoughts here, Dr. Meinard, of something that I've sort of called the soft free will defense, right? Because Thomists, they've kind of like not wanted to go with the contemporary philosophers on the free will defense. And I think that's correct, right? Why do I think that's correct? Well, I think it's correct for a couple of reasons. One is we think that God is perfectly free but can't sin. So there's clearly something about freedom that doesn't demand fallibility, right? Okay. However, given that God is pure act and anything in creation is a composite of act potency, we have just category. We have a severe category leap. And Maritain pulls us out brilliantly. He says, look, it's just going to be a sort of metaphysical necessity that any other will God creates is by nature fallible. It's at one Yeah, go ahead.
It's all the Thomists by saying that, because they actually say in the order of nature, not the order of grace, but the order of nature, angels can't fail. And he's like, no. Yeah.
And he says, like, what you're talking about is a square circle, a created infallible will, impossible, doesn't exist. Now, could God give special graces? Sure. And in fact, as Catholics, we kind of are committed to that, right? But then one of the brilliant things that Maritain does, I think this is right, is like, look, God is not just, a creator. He's a governor. And in the general run, he's going to govern things according to their nature. And ours is fallible, right? It's fallible. So he's aiming for love. And this is, I think, one of the brilliant, and it just hits you right in the heart, right? And I think it's so right. God's aiming for love. He's aiming for friendships, love, and communion. Requires the uniting of two independent free wills. Only God is impeccable by nature. Everything else could fail, right? God governs accordingly. We do fail. Duh. Great. God can work with that. God can work with that. Those insights, I think, if more people could just think about the problem of evil with those principles in hand, so many issues would be solved. Do you agree with me?
I do. I think that it's, if you have the principles in hand, you kind of just see that you don't need to start down certain paths.
Yes.
Right now, the way we're talking about it's not going to probably hold water for the analytics among us, because they think about, there are all sorts of other categories they're sticking freedom questions into, right? So we're talking definitely in a kind of developed Aristotelian, Neoplatonic Aristotelian framework. Once you got those principles, I mean, the other stuff starts to fall out relatively easily. I mean, relatively easily until you start to, you do face yourself up in a certain sense to the question of God's gratuity, right? Why is one thief on one side of Christ and the other there, right, doing different things? Well, it's like Augustine says, Garagovian loves to quote this, you just don't ask, you'll know that in the vision of God where his mercy and justice make sense in each other, but that the mystery remains. So I don't want to act like we're getting rid of the mystery, but some of the knot tying, I guess I never understood it. That's why I avoid this topic. You're the first person who's ever talked to me publicly about it, because I tend to find people tied in knots about something that I don't quite understand why they're tied in knots. It's like a puzzle that doesn't need to be a puzzle.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. Right. Yeah, we're never going to fully eliminate all the mystery related to, I like to say to the gratuity, right? But we can show how to avoid various mistakes of either making God the author of sin or turning God into like a Moloch type of figure, right?
Yeah.
Or just somebody who's like a crude utilitarian of like various greater goods theodicies. I've always been highly resistant to that and thinking, no, that's getting something fundamentally wrong, right?
Yeah.
And I think Maritain really just helps to set us straight on a lot of those things, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just think the philosophical backbone tools are just of such use. There was something else I thought in the midst of that. Well, so one way too that you think of this, like the next step of applying some of these principles is if all that we bring on our side is the nothingness, right? There's a real sense that you see here then how the whole of the moral life really is a kind of obedience. I don't like the word just because it's derivative of law, which legal language is already kind of 2 or 3 steps down in the conceptual stream, right? I'm not against the language of law and morals at all, but the first reason that the law is good is because goodness is good. The moral virtues are good. They're good in themselves. The infused moral virtues are good. Above all, the divine life of grace is good, right? And then, therefore, it's also a measure of our actions and hence the law. But okay, bearing all that in mind, you see how the whole of the creaturely life is this sort of obedience or this sort of open hand. It's a question of how open you're going to let your hand be, right? And so imperfect acts, for instance, are acts that are remiss, as the theologians would say. They're less than what I could do now, but it's because I've pulled back, but I've not entered the world of sin. I've not fully, I've not turned away from the rule, to use Maritain's language, but I've turned my eyes sort of aside, to do a lesser good, right? But all of the framework is there. It kind of fits together. You sort of see the moral life as a kind of withdrawing away from God. Then the more mystically inclined of us, or the more platonically inclined of us, can kind of bring in some of the metaphorical tools of the I think that is good in the Platonist tradition.
Yes.
To then see the way that the distancing from God is what we hold in ourselves as possible, and that distancing isn't an action. It's actually it's a negation which should be there, and then that's what causes the privation of a good that should be there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Excellent. So I wanted to just open by highlighting how useful and awesome I think Maritain is on the problem of evil, and just encourage everybody to read a lot of Maritain on that if they haven't already. What other aspects of Maritain's thought do you think deserve more attention, Dr. Miner? I mean, he's just he's an incredible generalist, right? So he just is he's got degrees of knowledge. He's on epistemology and his preface to metaphysics. But yeah, highlight some stuff for us.
What is? I mean, yeah, because the problem is, well, Untrammeled Approaches, even though it's quirky, the last book, like with all those essays, is really good. But I don't want to go there today. It's called Untrammeled Approaches. There's stuff in it that's like, critiquable, but he admits he's very often, as an old man, playing the role of a sort of theologian, sometimes sort of not. I mean, it's good to watch a free Thomist mind thinking. Be free, Yeah, but I don't know. I always come back to this. And anyone who heard me, I was just talking to Dr. Larry Chapp recently. And, I've read the whole Maritainian corpus multiple times. I forgot how much I had read it till I went back and looked at my notes for my licentiate thesis, my master's, quote unquote. I forgot I had taken so many notes from across Maritain. I was a lonely graduate student solo. Look, he was very important to me at a certain period of my life when I had left Benedictine life. Sort of Maritain, Lectio Divina, the Divine Office. That was sort of my life for like a year and a half. Yeah. But the degrees of knowledge, when I was talking to Larry, I said, I still can't begin to praise that enough, because it's just got kind of the whole framework of like, if you want to do Thomist epistemology, this is what it looks like. You deal with the problem of the sciences. There's a kind of internal squabble among the Thomists about how to think about the modern sciences and how they connect to Aristotle's philosophy of nature. But I still think that like there are great, important big bones for how to deal with that problem in him. I still kind of think that when we consider, for instance, modern physics broadly construed, so everything from classical mechanics down, what we might call physico-mathematical analysis of nature, I still think that the line that he and Yves Simone and others take is still the best, because they recognize the way that the structure of what those types of scientists are looking for is quite different, but different from the ontological or the quasi-metaphysical analysis that's going on in the physics, right? Yes. Aristotle's physics is concerned with, what did I just say in a course of mine, actually? I had a neat little turn of phrase. It's concerned with the being of becoming being, right? Because it's about motion. It's about what is it that becoming has attached to it in its kinesis side, its motion side, wherever there is a kind of change imperfectly from potency to act. It's not the same thing as like pure spiritual activity. It's what we experience all the time, right? But we want to give a kind of metaphysical analysis of that, or a quasi-metaphysical analysis, because it's not quite metaphysics yet.
Right, philosophy of nature still. Yeah.
But it's very important to see the way that it's already participatively metaphysical. That's an expression from Maritain, actually.
Yeah. You mentioned Simone. Obviously, we'll have to do another episode on him.
It's like, here, we're talking and throwing out books, and it's like random day, though. Your listeners should read his critique of moral knowledge and his metaphysics of knowledge are great texts. Yeah.
A friend of ours, Dr. Michael Torre, just released a volume on Simone.
That's actually what people should get. Actually, is Dr. Torre's volume. Michael's he's a great guy.
Really tremendous. Yeah, really. He's been on the show a number of times. We have frequent email conversations about these types of topics, and so all right. So epistemology for sure. I mean, one of the other, like, it's like Maritain and Lonergan for me on the epistemology side. Like, these guys were so useful getting me to see how well or how much the Thomistic resources can solve so many sort of modern epistemological issues. How friendly do you think Maritain and Lonergan are? Have you spent a lot of time with Lonergan? And
not a ton, right? I've read Verbum. I've read bits of Insight. I've flipped through my copy of Method and Theology. I mean, just because of the nature. The one thing with Lonergan is there's a bit of Lonerganese as you get into him outside of the Roman teaching context.
He's like a Barry Miller, right? He's like a guy that like you really have to work to just like read, you know what I mean?
And it's even in a sense, I don't say worse because that sounds negative, but it's even more pronounced than Maritain, right? People say Maritain's like that, but ultimately he's writing within actually the Dominican commentator tradition. So you can kind of start to see what he's doing. And, and it's like Lonergan's like so many of these blasted, like the good Jesuits, let's set aside the others, but like they're so cultured, right? This is something, it's just different about the Jesuits than the Dominicans. They're involved more broadly in contemporary culture, contemporary questions. They're more happy to be eclectic, which kind of can make it difficult at certain times whenever they then synthesize things. It's just, it doesn't bother them the same way it bothers Dominican or me, right? Even as a Byzantine, right? I've had to try and find a way to square the circle as I continue my life. That's because that's that conservative Thomist part of my soul. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I've often thought that if I really bought into the Lonergan, it would be like I would get, no pun intended, insight that I could then bring back to then expand like a kind of more Thomist language. But so, yeah, indirectly.
Yeah, that's so. All right. How would you? I mean,
I'm sorry to your listeners. I'm letting myself be a little all over the place.
No, this is just an informal conversation. It's fun. Look at it. Here he is, right here. There's the guy. If anyone wants to see his face.
Eternal memory. My stepfather used to say that the book haunted him because I'd always be bringing it back when I'd be on the train from DC coming home to visit my family. No matter what I was.
It is kind of a haunting cover, isn't it? Yeah. How would you? For somebody who's just not familiar with Maritain, how would you summarize his epistemology to people?
That's a heck of a.
Knowledge is definitely analogical.
Right, I got it. Right? It took me a second. Boy, that's like one of those questions when students ask you, and you're like, I don't know what you're actually asking about. The most important thing to take from like the degrees of knowledge, and it pops up throughout like even his like moral epistemology as well, is one of the great sins of modernity is a kind of leveling impulse, right? To bring, it's the kind of textbook way of presenting Descartes is you're looking for clear and distinct knowledge, and it is kind of based on a sort of mathematical model, and it becomes like the cat's meow in classical modernity. Spinoza is the best example of this, but he's doing something. The reason Spinoza's in the canon is because in a way he crystallized the temptation to reduce all of rational exposition to a kind of geometric deduction, right? And it's kind of it's a perverse version of the Euclideanism that's in some ways even in the background of something like the posterior analytics of Aristotle. But you get some axioms, then you deduce your conclusions from them, right? And you get your corollaries off to the side and whatnot. But there's a real leveling impulse. Think about how this affected the sciences, right? So you have a good example of this. I mean, it happened, I'm sure, before this, but one that sticks out. Professor Daniel Robinson. I don't know if you ever listened to his lectures from the great courses. He's a neat guy. He's just died just recently. He recounts this bit from around a generation before Freud, where all the kind of German academic world of what becomes psychology is obsessed with reducing every higher phenomenon effectively down to physics, right? Yes. Mm-hmm. Reduce the biology and physiology down to physics, reduce in the end the psychology. If you think about this in even sort of a kind of Freudian idea of subconscious and things that are repressed and coming up, it's a very mechanical model of there's something over here that it needs to come up and out. I mean, it's based on sort of a generation before him, certain figures that were looking for this kind of almost, statics and mechanics way of explaining the human psyche. Mm-hmm. And so this is like a real temptation for like, the whole of, I think, modern thought is to try and reduce things down. The same thing happens over in the social sciences too. I should keep private matters of the house, but it's one of these frustrations that psychology and sociology and anthropology, but more so sociology and psychology, want to just push all that down into a kind of statistical blob, unless it just becomes a bunch of social activism. One of the two. But anyway, that same leveling impulse is like not at all the Thomist approach to this. That Simone makes this point in one place brilliantly in a where he remarks how, notice that in the case of Christ, you have the proliferation of all those infused species the Thomists hold, right? He's got particular knowledge of all things infused by God. Now, theological problem to set aside, I tend a little bit more conservatively about that topic, following Father Nicola. But the point is that in human knowledge, this kind of pluriformity is not bad, that there's one lens to have in classical mechanics. There's another lens that you have when you're doing just pure mathematics. There's a different abstractive lens when you're doing the philosophy of nature, or when you're doing biology, or whenever you're doing, let alone the social sciences, right? Because that's a moral, there's a kind of moral datum. Mm-hmm. So there are different data that are established. Touré, man, good essay on facts in Maritain and Simone. Mm-hmm. Facts themselves are not these brute things that are trying to emerge out of the the physico-mathematical world, but instead just are constituted by human knowledge in its interaction with reality, and you try to grab the intelligibility of reality. And based on those facts, you eventually have principles, and you have different levels of abstraction, right? That's the idea of degrees of knowledge. And so there will be moral facts and biological facts and philosophy of nature facts and classical mechanics facts, and hence different sciences. So like, don't think that your epistemology should just be this neat little thing about finding criteria, because guess what? Even if you do take that kind of blasted criteria obsession of modernity, there are lots of criteria for what the first principles are like at all sorts of different levels.
Yeah.
And actually for phenomenology, right? To do a phenomenology of different kinds of facts.
Yeah, that's brilliant, right? Like being, knowledge comes in different ways, in many ways.
Thank you.
Right?
Well said, well summarized. Jump down in there. So
yeah, and he'll give you some almost 500 pages about all that and degrees of knowledge. This is probably, I have not read all of the works of Maritain, but I've read a lot. This is probably his most technical, at least that I've read.
I think so. I think that's fair. I mean, there are technicalities that, as he says in some place, they erupt on occasion in his other works. He'll say like,
he's got a very breezy style where he'll just kind of like,
he just jumps into like,
just dives right in. Yeah.
This has been a real plague on me because my style picked his up, and it has actually been a problem. I had John Rist. I don't know if you know Professor Rist. He hated my style at CUA. I looked back at it. Every time I'd catch myself like, don't write like Maritain. Don't write like Maritain.
When I read Maritain, it seems clear to me that and I could be totally wrong about this. It does seem like he's writing for himself primarily.
Oh, that's well said. Well said.
Yeah.
That's because what I think sometimes is don't just write for what you want to hear, Matthew. And it's the same thing. It's that same kind of devil, right? But he's in trance. You know why? Because he's a philosopher. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like I said to my students at the Byzantine seminary, we were in our moral theology class. I said, my besetting sin as a teacher is that sometimes I see my entire vocation here is that I'm thinking through these ideas and you guys are here for the ride, and I kind of get it to your level when I'm thinking through it. And I remember that when I grade your exams.
Yeah. But I love that, right? Because I love seeing that sort of that wrestling match that he's having with himself, with these ideas. He's not just trying to make it accessible. No, he's like, you can tell like, okay, I wasn't quite satisfied with that paragraph. So now I'm going to give you an 8-page footnote.
Yes. I know. Footnotes that go across multiple pages. There's a page in existence in the existent where there's one line at the top for 2 or 3 pages because this footnote keeps going from page to page.
But that's where some of the most brilliant stuff is. So if you read Maritain, you have to read the footnotes. Yeah.
You gotta read the footnotes.
Yeah. But just like be aware of these things because otherwise you might be a little, I don't know, shocked and jarred by his style. But personally, I love it. It's very satisfying if you're really looking for kind of like depth.
His vocation was to be a philosopher. That's why I try to, people sometimes think of him as a popularizer, or even like when they hear generalist. I think popularizer seems insane to me, but I've heard that.
He's not.
Yeah, it's like just because he wrote a couple of small books. I mean, and he did some stuff with the UN. It's like, anyway, go read the Degrees of Knowledge. But his vocation was to be a philosopher, and then his books are just him sort of philosophizing. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes him different from Gilson, for example. I mean, Gilson is a philosopher too, but it's always couched like in the background of being a historian.
Yes.
Yeah, the historian is operative in a way in him that's different. It sets certain hermeneutical boundaries and style boundaries to his Thomism that aren't the same for Maritain.
Yeah, and obviously it's funny you bring up Gilson because this is on epistemology, right? These guys definitely part ways. Right?
Yeah, they do. I mean, because there's this whole question of can there be such a thing as a critical realism? Maritain is getting actually something that's quite in the air among the Thomists of the strict observance, actually. This idea that, metaphysics passes over into a kind of critique of its principles, which is going to involve a critique of knowledge. I mean, so you'll find it's in Pirota, it's in Gret, it's in Garrigou as well, that you have kind of the ostensive side of metaphysics that's worried about like talking about being as being and act and potency and the transcendentals and things of that sort, the principles of being and causality, etc. Then you have critical metaphysics, which is, primarily for them a kind of critique of knowledge. Gilson tends to think that what they're doing, he's misreading them, I think. He thinks that they're doing something like Descartes, where they're, you're justifying knowledge at the beginning.
Yeah.
Right. And the most brilliant layout of the failure of that is Gilson's
methodical realism.
Well, methodical realism,
no, that's
the unity of philosophical reason, though. So methodical realism, and there's the other one on knowledge, that are a critique of knowledge, that are good in that debate. Like those are the ones that are most directly part of that debate. But the way that the mistake plays out, he does so well in the second and third part of the unity of philosophical experience. Kind of like, you start by asking the wrong question, and then you doom yourself.
Yeah, you're just trapped at that point,
so
right? Yeah,
that same thing is in the back of his mind whenever he's critiquing people in those other two epistemology works, where he says, you start in a Cartesian path, you'll end with the Cartesian conclusions. End of story.
Yeah.
There's interesting
and Maritain grants Gilson a fair amount in degrees of knowledge about that, but then he says, yeah, but still, we're going to do this, right?
Yeah, and interestingly, I mean, he's doing that in the pages of the degrees of knowledge, just as, hold on, finger up there, let me see, just as Garrigou is doing in The Order of Things. There are two essays in the second half of The Order of Things that are on that too, where he engages very charitably with Gilson, but basically in the same line as Maritain. Very important to remember that Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange's thought and Maritain's thought in the end are still very close to each other.
Yeah, I think that's important because certainly I think people get the impression that it's somewhat the opposite of that, right?
Yeah,
that
the trads hate the Roman trads hate Maritain, and they think that they have an idea of Garrigou that's based solely on the 1947 anti-modernist thing.
Yeah,
I mean, I hate to be that direct. I hate to be that I have to just do. It's just more nuanced. It's more troublesome than that. Garrigou was so influential on him, and I think even though Maritain kind of keeps doing his thing afterwards, he's a Garagovian in many important ways till the end. The principles are there. Some of his conclusions are different, but the principles remain very Garagovian.
Yeah, and Maritain he did seem also interested in and I guess I don't know. I guess he does remind me a bit like say Father Norris Clark in some ways. He is interested in a sort of creative completion, if you will.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Do you agree with that?
Yes. He's not worried. He's not a commentator. He likes the commentators actually quite a bit, but he's not a commentator. He wants Thomism. He said at one point to Simone, actually, like he wanted Thomism to be alive in the existential condition of man today, which means you're going to have to bring it to a certain completion. A great example of that's the aesthetics things.
Yeah.
Because I hate this because too many Thomists are going to say, well, there is no aesthetics, or right, that's all Maritain's made up thing. It's like, well, he took Thomist principles and wanted to apply it to the phenomenon of making and art. And so art and scholasticism, the situation of poetry, creative intuition in art and poetry, which was like, I think the first of those Mellon lectures. Like read it, think it's the first, and then be surprised that those lectures still last to today. Whenever you think of like the scholasticism he erupts out into, it's like you would think they would have said, we're done with this. We're never inviting another Catholic ever again. And then like 4 years later, they invite Gilson to do the painting and reality lecture.
Yeah, that's so funny. So what would be your sort of, I guess your layman's reading list of Maritain? If you say, if nothing else, start here and then read this and then read that.
Yeah, layman's reading list. So I would actually say like total layman.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
You start with like the St. Thomas Aquinas volume, right? He does this little like semi-devotional thing in the 20s. Another one that if you can kind of just turn your brain off a little bit for where he is himself and he starts talking technical in the middle of even like his personal memoir musings, The Peasant of the Garonne, I think, has enough of a tone where it's like it's someone reflecting right after the Second Vatican Council. That there's enough fighting with certain figures, like the 50 Pages of Anger at Terre de Chardin. People like that stuff, right? It's like how people love to read interviews. So I mean, in a sense, that gets you into like an outlook of his life. Man, if you're a little bit more technical, Man in the State, that political guy is probably easier. Not scholasticism and politics, but Man in the State because of the politics stuff.
The Marquette lecture we mentioned on evil.
Yeah, the Marquette lecture. Yeah, the Marquette lecture actually, as long as you can deal with the Thomist texts, it's very direct. It's on one problem. It's devoted to the issue of evil. So yeah, St. Thomas and the Problem of Evil, or whatever the name of that one is.
Yeah.
I wish I could recommend the aesthetic works, but I just really don't think I can. You know, one that's of interest.
Would you say on metaphysics? You say preface to metaphysics or existence?
Oh yeah,
that
was that was I in my mind I thought I said it because I was thinking if it's pure layman you can't start there, but preface to metaphysics is a good place to go if you're kind of like you're at least somewhat philosophically educated. I think that's a neat little text from the 1930s, preface to metaphysics. Mm-hmm. And then the philosophy of history that gets you into some of his themes in morals as well. I mean, there are other moral texts, but that's a good morals text. Actually. The philosophy of history is mine. So,
yeah, that's really helpful. And if nothing else, I hope this conversation will encourage people to dive deeper into Maritain's thought. We have a question here from Octus. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, because and you can get these. Clooney has, I think, republished them. Liturgy and Contemplation and Contemplation and Intelligence or something like that. Holiness. I forget the name of it right now because I have a little volume and then they republished it. So maybe I'll think of it and then I'll tell you.
Sure. What do you think of this question here? Octa says, what is your assessment of Maritain's formal logic?
Yeah, that's a great text. I mean, it's a blasted shame that the formal logic text didn't have its material logic with it. He started it. He got like 80 pages into it. And so the formal logic text is the second of two in a series of pedagogical texts that he was going to write. And exactly what you said applies here. He was too much Maritain. He has these excurses where he goes into this technical stuff in what is supposed to be an undergraduate textbook of logic. But that logic textbook is ultimately based on a real solid foundation of John of St. Thomas, right? The Thomist school, or the Thomists, the people who broadly were defending Thomas had to stand up against the nominalists, the people in the wake of William of Ockham and Buridan and Durandus of St. Pourçain and others, to really answer some questions of logic that Thomas hadn't answered. And so in John of St. Thomas, you get this wonderful crystallization. I mean, we only have the outlines of formal logic in English right now. There's a whole section of the questions on formal logic that aren't translated. And we have a partial translation that Yves, Simone, and others did of the material logic stuff. But the formal logic text is good. Problem is, it's like you have to almost be ready to deal with the technicality as well.
Of course. Yeah. So just get ready for Maritain to be super Maritain on you.
Yeah, that's it. There will be exercises at the end of the section, but it won't feel quite as well written as a textbook.
Yeah, you keep bringing up Simone. What's really cool is to kind of see where Simone kind of picks up from Maritain in certain places. He for example, in Preface to Metaphysics, Maritain has just a pretty thick but really interesting paragraph about the principle of sufficient reason and human freedom. And I don't know if you remember which one I'm talking about, right? But he shows how one actually lends support to the other. And then Simone just takes that whole paragraph and almost turns it into a whole book, or at least substantial part of a book, which is freedom of choice, right?
Yeah. Funny enough, I have to go back and look at this. It's been a long time since I've read Preface to Metaphysics. I bet that's very. So two things. I wonder if it actually says principle of sufficient reason in the French. I bet.
I couldn't tell you.
I bet if because he's such a garagovian, it's the principle of raison d'etre, which always is getting translated as sufficient reason. So let's just note that, because Garrigou is very careful because he doesn't like that Leibnizian stuff, that rationalism, which is interesting by itself. But I bet that there's something in there that's actually based on the best treatment of freedom that they all owe something to. In the second volume of the God volume by Garrigou, there is 60 pages on God's freedom that has the best defense of the metaphysics of freedom that you'll find among the Thomists of that era. So, but it's interesting. So then Simone, though, takes this one insight and develops it into the freedom of choice book, which is typical Yves Simone, whereas Maritain is big and swooping and he does everything at once. Simone's I got one problem.
Super precise. Yeah.
I'm going to laser focus in and I'm going to write a whole book on, Aristotle's definition of metaphysics. But he's going to do it so that you see every term in the definition of not metaphysics, of virtue. Sorry. And I'm going to see every term that Aristotle uses when he defines what virtue is. And I'm going to now see it with utter clarity. And that's all I did. I, gave a couple lectures. It's a little book that's 150 pages, and move on. He does that all the time.
Yeah, they're both so brilliant. Freedom of choice is such a brilliant little volume.
That is
Here's another question from Matt. He says, "What are your thoughts? Who's correct in this debate? Dr. Miner, do you have
I'm of the opinion of, I think Yves Simone's blistering review is correct.
Can you summarize this for people who might not be familiar?
Makes the point. So, okay, so thank you. It's like not a teaching moment. There's this huge fight over the question of the common good that erupts in the Catholic French world. Is that in the 40s? 40s or 50s? I forget. But yeah, it probably had to be at least into the 40s, late 40s. Charles de Connick at the University of Laval, very influential, and in many ways, I wish the Maritain guys could talk to the de Connick guys more, because there's much actually that overlaps. But de Connick writes a book about the defense of the common good against the personalists. Now, the personalists are never named, and the way he talks about them definitely isn't in Maritainian language. There's correspondence, or at least private recollections that seem founded, that say he never read a lot of Maritain. But it was taken as a book that was written against Maritain's politics.
It was sort of pinned on Maritain, right?
Yeah, as though Maritain is against the subordination of the creatures to the common good, the humans to the common good. Maritain basically, wants to make the point that the political common good is not the ultimate common good of the human soul, right? Ultimately, you have a transcendence that's only directly specified by the common good that is God. Mm-hmm. Right, because we have a speculative, contemplative end. Even by nature, even if we set aside the question of grace, the human person has a kind of transcendence over the political order, and is not limited merely to the limited good that is the intratemporal flourishing of a just society. But the way that it's laid out, Simone makes a point. It's like, you lay out a good account of St. Thomas's Doctrine of the Common Good, Charles de Connick. It's in a review article in a Review of Politics or something, and it's substantially Maritain's position, but in the end, your book is good as a layout, is good for a layout of the Thomist approach to the common good, and it has nothing to do with a debate with Maritain whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And I think, truth be told, I'm going to watch my language, because I'm going to start making enemies because I'm doing these talks. I think it's a little dishonest, at least the way that people today pin them against each other, though. I'm not saying people are actually actively being dishonest, but maybe they're being lazy. They're not reading Maritain.
Mm-hmm. That happens all the time, unfortunately, doesn't it?
Yeah, but the problem is sort of the political questions that are being raised nowadays, the kind of re-raising of questions about integralism and things of that sort. Which, truth be told, I consider myself a sort of mitigated integralist, even myself. Probably more along the lines of someone like Journet.
So that'd be a good T-shirt, mitigated integralist.
I know, one of my students laughed. He said, he said, you've given me the term for myself. But with all that stuff being raised, you are getting it kind of coming back up again, right? And I've run into, I bet I have seen or heard somewhere Sohrab Ahmari mention de Connick. And that's dangerous, because you're a very intelligent man, but you're not a philosopher. And it's like, you cannot be living in this world where it's like, we have this great approach to the common good, which is the integralist future of post-liberalism. And it's not the evils, this is the implied subtext, the evils of the post-Vatican II church, which have all that Maritain, for instance. Or that's, in the end, it's the echoes of a certain traditionalist line. Like, it's too simple.
Let me say this from a personal standpoint. I guess if I would have taken certain echoes seriously, I might not have ever read Maritain, and I would have been severely diminished in my thought because of that. So what's the lesson here? Just read.
Just read.
Just read. Right.
St. Paul makes this point in the epistles. He's like, don't bicker. And is this a family-friendly podcast?
Yeah.
Okay, then I won't say it. But don't bicker and moan with each other. Right. Just have at it like brothers, be angry, but don't sin, so just
right.
And don't do this sort of writing of things off,
Yeah. And just don't be lazy. Don't be lazy.
I know I'm a Slav. Miner's my last name, but I'm about half Slavic. It's like, that's the greatest sin for a Slav, is being lazy.
Being lazy. That's so funny. Just want to highlight this comment here. Robert says, Dr. Meinert is the man. He is. Thanks for the interview. His moral theology is fire. Definitely have him on to talk about that in the future. Yeah, we'd love to have you, Dr. Meinert.
Poor God. I should pitch that guy, because Ascension Press likes me to do that. Go to ascensionpress.com/Catholic Morality. But yeah, that was a real pleasure to do that book.
So I know we're coming up against our time constraints here, but what are you currently working on right now? What projects do you have in the queue, and what can we expect from you in the future?
Yeah, so I have things I'm not allowed to say. So I've got a couple of super secret things for the Russians, right? Our new Ukrainian priest is actually from Russia. No. So what's coming out that's of interest? Let me think here. Well, there's an interesting,
or just replug or repitch any of your recent volumes that came out as well, please.
Draw attention to, because there's one that my name is eventually going to get attached to as quote unquote editor. I did most of the translating for it and then edited it all. Father Emmanuel Durand of I think the Parisian province. He was teaching at the Ange at the time. I translated a whole host of his essays on. It's pitched as being Thomist scriptural stuff, but it's really a whole host of themes that come up on just topics of providence and topics of divine transcendence and of course naming of God, the question of God's emotions and all of that, and how to approach it in both like a Thomistic way that's not, however, or is engaged in some of the more modern hermeneutical approaches to things. It's a really lovely volume. I'm not going to remember the name now of the title, right? Because it's not my own book. It's a little different doing it, but that's an interesting little book that's coming out. The text that I feel like people who've been following me with Michael Lofton feel like this has been going on for forever, but it's the nature of publishing. But the really exciting one that's going to cause I hope like consternation and hence sell books is with CUA Press book on the Nouvelle Theologie. It's all the translations of the Dominicans, the Dominican side basically of that. And our reviewers, Dr. John Kerwin and I worked on that volume. Our reviewers loved it. And so it's with CUA, it's just in that endless process. And then I'm editing endless manuscripts. I've got the Jean-Hervé Nicolas Christology section that's coming out at the end of the year. I sent off the section on the church and the sacraments. It's like 300,000 words. And I guess I have to finish editing his second volume, the one in which the evil stuff is found. I translated it, but I need to do the final edits and get it to CUA, but it won't be published for like 2.5 years because we're spreading it out. And then of course, I guess I should say yoink, because you can't do 1,500 pages of Garagou. And right behind me, my fingers are like, I can't do it with
He's there, yeah.
But the 2 volumes of On Divine Revelation are coming out very, very soon.
Awesome.
And of course, the Conscience book. So it's been busy. Last year was insane. So the other thing I'm doing is to keep myself sane is making sure I go ski, because I like to just go blasting down a slope at 40 or 50 miles an hour. So
yeah, well, yeah, of course, we all need those seemingly recreational activities for sure. Yeah. So yeah, this has been an absolute blast. We're going to have you on again just to dive deeper on all the different stuff that you've worked on and researched and written about. Where else can people keep up with you? A website or what else?
The best place to sort of keep up with that and the random other things I do is on philosophicalcatholic.com. Philosophical Catholic, one word, straight through, philosophicalcatholic.com. I got to update it. I got to put some new cocktails up. I have a cocktail section that was meant to be my thing for getting people to come, but I have a little booklet that I'm like, get these things up on there, like ones I've tried and experimented on relatives that worked. So
that's awesome. That's great. Well, I'm going to link that in the show notes. I'll link your books. I'll link the ones, at least
link the web. I would actually just link the website book section is what I would.
Easy.
One-stop shop.
You got it. All right, beautiful. This has been great. I think hopefully at the very least, we've enticed people to go and read Maritain. So
go.
Dr. Maritain, thank you so much. It's been a blast.